Good evening and welcome to our weekly book study here at the New Covenant House. We have that every Wednesday at 7 p.m. We are, as you probably know by now, studying this book, Christian Anarchism, by Alexander Christianopoulos, who wrote it as his doctoral thesis. Oops. We have just started chapter 3 in the book, which kind of examines the state and the church. And chapters 1 and 2 were examining the scriptures according to, so that we'll see what the Christian anarchists think according to the scriptures. And this is the other way around. We are examining the actual church and the state and see what the Christian anarchists think about that. So today we are doing a little mini-series here, we're starting some church history. It's in two parts. The first part is the early church, which comes before Constantine's takeover of the church. And then the other part, which is next week, we're going to talk about everything from the 4th century up to the modern time. We're not going to dwell a lot on it because we really want to get into the next part, which is an examination of the modern state. But this gives a necessary piece of background for all of this that we're going to be doing later on. So Constantine is a very important person. He was a Roman emperor. He ruled from 306 to 327, so about 20 years or so. At the time, I think the Roman Empire was kind of getting a little unstable, and Constantine wanted to assemble it again. So we'll get back to that. But first of all, we begin with the early church, which is the period of time from the resurrection and up to actually from Pentecost, maybe, if you think of it that way, but around there, and then up to the end of Constantine's reign, or at least till the beginning of the 4th century. We don't really know a whole lot about that church. We do have, Paul's writings, but there isn't that much recorded about it that we can really hang our hat on. And the other thing is that there was Jesus clearly talked about one universal church, but in reality is that there were probably more than the different churches were independent, except we saw at one point the Paul baptized people who were not circumcised, so he had to go to Rome and confer with the other apostles if it was necessary for the Gentiles to become Jews before they could become Christians. So, and the answer was that they did not need to be circumcised as long as they held a couple of other rules. I think one of them was to not eat any food that has been sacrificed or strangled, and something else also. But the rules were very simple for them to become Christians. But the thing is that the early church they were probably very diligent and faithful in teaching was Jesus had kind of implementing what Jesus has taught them to do, but they also began to have their own individual ideas, and kind of became a little bit sectarian sometimes. But anyway, so they maintained this idea that they were bore witness to the citizen of another kingdom, and was a statement of opposition to the state and its idolatry, violence, and injustice. That never changed, really, for the first couple of 100 years. The first thing that really became different was that it says around 170 AD, it kind of become accepted to be in the military. That was unthinkable for the really early church. But you can understand that the early church members were being persecuted left and right. And I can imagine that they got a little tired of that. So there were some that were agreed with this idea that they could join the military, and some others did not. But as a whole, by the end of the 2nd century, a significant number of them had kind of like begun to sympathize with these affairs of the state. It says the Christian church had developed a more sympathetic approach to the affairs of the state. And then came the big event where Constantine, in an attempt to unify Rome, the Roman Empire, made Christianity the official religion of Rome, with the Edict of Milan. And probably the reason for that is that even though the Christians were being persecuted, they increased in numbers, and they also began to have power in so many ways. For the Christians, for the Christian anarchists, if Constantine had to do this, it was because Christianity had become too powerful a popular mass movement, because this Christian truth was therefore politically dangerous, and because adopting and distorting Christianity could help him unite the fragmented Roman Empire. So, in other words, and that's something that rulers do all the time, they find the scapegoat, like the Second World War, the Holocaust and all of that is an example of that. They began to blame everything on the Jews. The Jews had to be eradicated as a means of diverting people's attention from the suffering that they were going through. There was, that's a different story. We're not going to get into that today. So what happens is Andrews, we met him before. He wrote the Plan B book that we did last year. He tempted the clergy by exempting them from state taxes or army duties, and by promising to silence the more defiant voices within the church, using the powers of the state to enforce unanimous acceptance of the Nicene Creed. The Nicene Creed comes a little bit later, where Constantine convenes all these clergy and get them together in one place, Nicaea, where they cannot agree on what what it means to be Christian, and they develop the Nicene Creed, and there was obviously dissent. There were people who didn't agree with that, and they needed to be whipped into into compliance. And Constantine had the power to do that. So he has now established this unholy alliance with Pope Sylvester I, and kind of became one and the same. The state and the church became one and the same. The church said yes to the very temptation that Jesus denies, and that was one of the temptations in the wilderness. You remember that? He was tempted first with turning stones into bread, and the second one was he could jump from the pinnacle of the temple or something like that, and the angels would come and catch him. And the third one was that he would, if he would bow down to Satan and worship him, he would give him all this land. So, in other words, what happened here with the church is that they had become the opposite of what Jesus was trying to establish when he was here. So, Constantine now had a church that was completely different from what Jesus had imagined from the beginning. So some revisions had to be done. And the man for the job was Augustine. Number one, he was not the main writer, but there were also Athanasius and Ambrose were also part of that. But Augustine was the main man to rewrite Christianity to fit into Constantine's worldview. The revisions, Constantine played a central role in revising Christian theology to accommodate an alliance of throne and altar. This essential and detrimental contribution by Augustine and other theologians is further explored later in this chapter. So we'll get to that. The point here is that the Christian anarchists thinks that Constantine was like a turning point, something very significant changed. The transformation of the church from a subversive anarchist threat to a collaborator with the state. And Christianity had done all the changing. And yeah, the state had not done any changing, just the Christianity had changed. The one other good way to say that is coming up a little bit later, I think. The empire became Christian and the church became imperial. Yeah. We often see now writings from modern writers using the term empire about the state and the government as a whole. We know that the American government structure is not an empire, but they refer to it as an empire because they use this imagery of Rome, not just Rome as an empire, but everything that Rome stood for. So the empire becomes a symbol of everything that's evil. coercive, and oppressive. So this was all happening. There was just a few dissenters, and there were two alternatives for true Christians, were monasticism and the sectarian churches. So this is also the time when monasticism begins to develop, and Benedict writes his Rules of Life. And some Christians move out into the desert and live there. So Christianopolis here refers to the Christianity that has now developed as Imperial Christianity. Here, Imperial Christianity spread among the Roman middle classes and other similarly ungodly persons, resulting in even further compromises with the state power. Those who disagreed with these trends were persecuted, judged, and condemned. So this was the Edict of Milan and the Council of Nicaea. Was how Constantine ushered in this new alliance of throne and altar. So there's one person who writes a lot about this. This is Celsius. We've met him before, and he wrote a book named The Net of Faith, which kind of is a summary of his whole worldview. And there's a passage in that book, the whole idea behind that book is coming from Luke chapter 5, verses 4 to 11. And let me just read that for a change here. We have some time to do that. So Jesus was preaching from Peter's boat, and then when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we worked hard all night and haven't caught anything, but because you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. And so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on you will fish for people." So they pulled their boats up on shore, left everything, and followed him. So this is the passage that gave rise to Celsius' book, The Net of Faith. And the imagery he's talking about is that the net contains all the people of the church. But what has happened is that two large whales have gotten in there and they're breaking the net. Two huge predators, the Pope and the Emperor. Celsius writes that even though the early churches remained faithful to Jesus' teaching for over 300 years, the net became greatly torn when the two great whales entered it. So, in other words, the Pope and the Emperor were messing up the church completely. Because now there was not only Christ's law, there was also the temporal and the papal law. So in other words, there's secular law and the papal and the Pope's law. Even though the Pope represents the church, Pope's law is different from Christian law. Thus, like other Christian anarchists, Chilsiki argues that instead of reforming the empire to conform to Christianity, Christianity was reformed to conform to the empire. Instead of giving their trust to and seeking help from God alone, Christians began to give their trust and seek help from the emperor. And then he refers to the book of Samuel, where we saw how the Israelites wanted a king, but God told them this is going to be terrible, so no. But they insisted, and he gave them a king, and of course it was terrible. Yeah. And another thing that happened is that the empire adopted the cross as a symbol of as their symbol, but it was really a symbol of Jesus' loving sacrifice. But the Romans, the emperor, adopted as theirs. And at some point, it became mandatory for soldiers to be Christians, and anybody really in Rome who wasn't a Christian was going to be persecuted as a heretic. This is really something that belongs to next week, where we will see that this is not in the book. This is just something I know, that the Scandinavian Nordic countries all have a flag with a cross in it, and the story goes that the Danish king, in collaboration with the Bishop of Copenhagen, were conquering places in the Baltics, on the coast, and they were not doing well. So this flag came down from heaven, the red flag with a white cross on it. So this is another example of how the state has adopted Christianity and kind of made it into its own image. Just thought I'd mention that. So it's actually faced by Christianity's growing political force. Roman state had nominally adopted it and perverted it, had nominally adopted it and perverted it with the complicity of church elites. So, and we'll see that later on in history, that kings and princes have power because the church is supporting them. Anyway, so that's pretty much what happened up until Constantine's time. Next week we're going to be talking about what happens in the dark ages of Christianity, from 400 up to modern times. Yeah, but definitely the Constantine's takeover of the church is a really, really important part of Christianity, or the history of Christianity. But that's all I have for tonight, and we'll see you next week. Thank you for coming.